What if the most pivotal moment in American military history was not decided on a battlefield, but in a quiet room between two men who despised each other, over a piece of news that changed everything, and almost no one knows the full story? In the closing months of World War II, the name George S. Patton was synonymous with thunder. He was the general who had driven his Third Army across France with a ferocity that stunned even his own allies, liberating town after town, crushing German resistance with a speed that military historians would spend decades trying to fully comprehend. But Patton was also a problem, a brilliant, explosive, ungovernable problem, and the men above him knew it. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, had spent years managing Patton the way one manages a fire, close enough to use the heat, far enough not to get burned. And Harry S. Truman, the plain-spoken man from Missouri who had inherited the presidency after Franklin Roosevelt's death on April 12, 1945, was watching everything with the cold, calculating eyes of a leader who had no patience for chaos dressed up as genius. If this story moves you, if it makes you feel the weight of history pressing down on the present, then subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, share it with someone who loves real history, the kind that is messy and human and devastating, and drop a comment below telling us what you thought you knew about Patton before you clicked play, because what comes next will almost certainly change it. The war in Europe was grinding toward its inevitable conclusion in the spring of 1945, but the political landscape was transforming just as violently as the military one. Patton had already survived one near-career-ending scandal, the infamous soldier-slapping incidents of August 1943 in Sicily, when he struck two hospitalized soldiers suffering from combat fatigue, calling them cowards in front of witnesses. Eisenhower had been furious. He had written Patton a letter of reprimand so severe it could have ended any lesser man's career entirely. He had forced Patton to publicly apologize to the men he had struck, to the medical staff, and to each division under his command. The press had exploded. The public had been outraged. And yet Eisenhower had kept him because he needed him, because there was simply no one else on earth who could do what Patton did with armor and speed and sheer aggressive will. That decision, to keep Patton in 1943, would echo in ways Eisenhower could not yet imagine as 1945 unfolded and the world began reshaping itself around the ruins of the Nazi regime. By the summer of 1945, Germany had surrendered. The formal capitulation came on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, and across the Allied world, people wept and danced and collapsed in relief. But for Patton, the end of the fighting brought not peace but restlessness, not satisfaction but fury. He had been appointed military governor of Bavaria, a position that placed him in charge of overseeing the denazification process in one of the most symbolically charged regions of the former Reich. It was precisely the wrong job for precisely the wrong man. Patton's views on the post-war order were dangerously out of step with official Allied policy. He believed the real enemy was not the defeated Germans but the advancing Soviets. He spoke openly, recklessly, about the possibility of rearming former German soldiers to push back against Soviet expansion. These were not private thoughts whispered in a diary, they were statements made in meetings, at press conferences, in letters, in conversations that had a way of leaking into the world. Then came September 22, 1945, the press conference that detonated everything. A reporter asked Patton about the denazification program, about why so many former Nazi Party members still held administrative positions in Bavaria under his watch. Patton's answer was almost incomprehensible in its political recklessness. He compared Nazi Party membership to membership in the Democratic or Republican parties back home, as if joining a party responsible for the Holocaust were no different from registering to vote in an American election. The room went silent for a breath, then erupted. The wire services carried the remarks around the world within hours. In Washington, the reaction was volcanic. Truman, who had survived the impossible transition from vice president to wartime commander-in-chief in a matter of hours, who had made the most consequential military decisions in human history with the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9 of 1945, was not a man who tolerated this kind of damage. He expected discipline. He expected results. And he expected his generals to understand that the war they were now fighting was political, not military. Eisenhower received the news about Patton's press conference the way a surgeon receives word that a patient has torn open his own stitches. There was no surprise, only a deep and exhausted recognition that this moment had always been coming. The relationship between Eisenhower and Patton was one of the most complex in American military history, layered with mutual respect, profound admiration, and an almost irreconcilable difference in temperament and judgment. They had known each other since the 1930s. They had trained together, argued together, and built the doctrine of armored warfare together in the years when tanks were still considered an experiment. But where Eisenhower was patient, political, and measured, Patton was volcanic, impatient, and constitutionally incapable of saying the safe thing when the dangerous thing was so much closer to what he actually believed. Now, in the fall of 1945, with the world watching and Truman furious in Washington, Eisenhower had to make a choice that would define both men's legacies forever. If you are still watching, and you should be, this is the moment to subscribe to this channel, to like this video, to share it with someone who understands that the real battles of history are always fought between men, not just armies, and to leave a comment below about the moment in this story that surprised you most, because the next part of this narrative is where history truly breaks open. Eisenhower flew to Frankfurt and summoned Patton. The meeting on September 28, 1945, was brief, painful, and absolute. Eisenhower removed Patton from command of the Third Army, the army Patton had led from Normandy to the heart of Germany, the army whose very name had become a symbol of American military dominance. In Patton's place, Eisenhower gave him command of the 15th Army, a paper command, a historical research unit with no combat role whatsoever, tasked with compiling the lessons of the European campaign. It was, in every practical sense, a burial, a way of removing Patton from the public stage without firing him outright and triggering the firestorm that would surely follow. Patton understood exactly what it meant. He wrote in his diary that night with the bitterness of a man who has spent his whole life preparing for a war that is now over, and who can feel history closing around him like a fist. Truman's role in all of this is one of the most underappreciated dimensions of the Patton story. He had never liked Patton. Unlike Roosevelt, who had tolerated Patton's eccentricities with a kind of patrician amusement, Truman saw Patton as exactly the type of officer who endangered everything America was trying to build in the post-war world. Truman was already navigating the opening moves of what would become the Cold War, the ideological and geopolitical confrontation with the Soviet Union that would define the next half-century of human history. The last thing he needed was a rogue general making inflammatory statements about rearming Germans and fighting Soviets while the world was still processing the magnitude of what had just ended. When the news of Patton's press conference reached Truman, he did not yell. He did not threaten. He simply made clear to Eisenhower that this situation required resolution, and that he expected it handled. The message was unmistakable. Eisenhower, who understood power and its quiet languages better than almost anyone, acted within days. What Truman said privately about Patton during this period has been pieced together from diaries, letters, and the testimony of those who were in the room. He referred to Patton as a man who had confused personal bravado with military wisdom, a soldier of extraordinary gifts who had never learned the most important lesson of high command, which is that at a certain level, war is no longer about courage but about consequences. Truman had profound respect for military service. He had served himself in World War I as a captain of artillery in France, but he had no patience for what he perceived as Patton's fundamental inability to understand that the battlefield was now political, that the enemy was now uncertainty, and that every careless word spoken by an American general in occupied Europe had the potential to destabilize the fragile architecture of the peace that millions had died to make possible. These were not abstract concerns. The Soviets were already testing boundaries. The United Nations was barely formed. Europe was a continent of rubble and refugees and unresolved borders, and into this landscape Patton kept throwing grenades of rhetoric. George S. Patton never commanded troops in combat again. On December 9, 1945, while on a pheasant hunting trip near Mannheim, Germany, he was riding in a 1938 Cadillac Model 75 when the vehicle was struck by an American military truck at a road junction. The collision was relatively low speed, but Patton was thrown forward violently, and his head struck the partition behind the driver. He suffered a fracture dislocation of the cervical spine and was left paralyzed from the neck down. He was transported to the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, where doctors quickly understood that his injuries were catastrophic. For 12 days he lingered, receiving visitors, dictating thoughts, telling his wife Beatrice, who had flown to Germany immediately, that this was a hell of a way to die. On December 21, 1945 at 17:55 local time, General George S. Patton died of pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure, not on a battlefield, not in the chaos he had always half expected to claim him, but in a quiet hospital room in a city he had helped to liberate, the war over, his command gone, his moment past. Eisenhower learned of Patton's death with a grief that was complicated by everything that had passed between them. He had admired Patton with an intensity that never really diminished, even when he had been forced to punish him, sideline him, and finally strip him of the command that had defined his life. In the years that followed, as Eisenhower rose to become Supreme Commander of NATO forces, then President of Columbia University, then the 34th President of the United States, elected in 1952 in a landslide that reflected the nation's extraordinary trust in the man who had led the Allied crusade in Europe, he would speak of Patton with a kind of reverent, sorrowful admiration. He said on more than one occasion that Patton was the greatest battlefield commander he had ever seen, and that the tragedy of Patton's life was that his greatest gifts were inseparable from his greatest flaws. Truman, for his part, said little about Patton after his death. He had moved on to other battles, other crises, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, the Korean War, the relentless machinery of the post-war world demanding his full attention. The story of what Truman said when Eisenhower received the news that shifted everything around Patton is, in the end, not just a story about one general's fall from grace. It is a story about the impossible tension between military genius and political responsibility, between the man of action and the man of consequence, between the kind of courage that wins wars and the kind of wisdom that builds peace. History does not always honor its most dramatic figures. Sometimes it sidelines them, quietly and efficiently, because the moment has moved on and they have not. Patton blazed across the 20th century like a comet, brilliant, disruptive, impossible to ignore, and like a comet he burned out not in a blaze of glory but in the cold, quiet aftermath of everything he had helped to create. If this story reached something in you, if it made you feel the weight of history, the cost of genius, the loneliness of command, then please subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss another story like this one, like this video so that more people can find it. Share it with someone who needs to understand that the greatest figures of history are always more human than the monuments suggest. And leave a comment below telling us what part of this story you had never heard before. Because every comment is a reminder that history is not dead, it is alive in every one of us who chooses to remember it.